I'm now going to go back to creating some of our particle emitters and go back into the properties and take a look at some of the settings we haven't completely covered yet. I'm going to switch just to our perspective view, and under the Dynamics tab select Particle, and I'm going to select an HV emitter, and we can just keep this named emitter, and I'm going to click OK. I'm just going to close out this panel, and I want to work with this directly within the object's properties, so Shift O and then P on the keyboard to bring up our object properties. And I'm just going to reposition our views a little, and we're going to select our Dynamics tab. We can select the Effects emitter, and one thing I want to show you is the way that our size effect works. Now if we take a look at size effect, you can see we have size no change, density to fix, mass change, and we have a speed change, whether or not it's based on speed, speed density fix, mass density fix, lots of different options, and basically those are in direct relation to the size of the emitter itself. So before I was talking about how we don't want to change the size of the emitter itself, and we'd want to use the generator size. Well, now we can take a look at actually changing the size of our emitter within layout with the size option, and that way we can see some of the different effects that we can get from our size effect. So let's take a look at our first one, which is going to be size density fix, which is a mass change. But first we are going to have to set out this object a little. I'm going to go to our motion options, go to explosion, type in a value of 3, and I might turn that down a little bit more, maybe to 2. I have 300 frames currently in our timeline, so I want to make sure I go to particle and change our lifetime to 300 frames. And now we can take a look at our motion. We can see the resistance showing up. I'm going to go ahead and remove the resistance just so we can have these particles really spreading out, and it'll be a little bit easier to tell what's going to happen once we change our size. So if I calculate, we're just going to see this typical animation, very consistent in the way that our particles are generated, basically the same throughout the entire 300 frames. So let's create some keyframes for our size. So I'm going to go to the Animate tab, and we can select size, or we can use the scroll on the mouse, which will cycle through our position, stretch, rotation, and then also our overall scale. So at frame 0, I'm going to keep this at 1, and I'm going to drag into 60 frames, and I'm going to increase our scale. And I also have Auto Key Create currently on, so it's automatically going to create keyframes as I make these modifications at parts of the timeline in which there currently are no frames. I'm going to drag this now to, let's bring it up to 120, and I'm going to scale it down to around 0.5 on all of our axes. And I'm going to bring this up a little bit higher. Let's jump all the way to 220. And scale that up to about 4. And then at frame 300, bring that down a little bit. So now we have some size changes with our keyframes. And we can see that going in and out. And we can also see what's already happening to our emitter. Now I do want to make sure we have enough particles within our scene. And right now it's set to 1000, and more than likely we're going to be using all of those. So I'm going to put in 2 more zeros just to make sure we have more than enough, and I can calculate this effect now, and we'll be able to see really drastic changes. Okay, so now I'm just going to close out the panel so we can see this a little bit better. And just reposition our perspective view. And now I'm just going to scrub through And we can see as it gets larger, we have a lot more particles being created within that volume. And as we change our size much smaller, there's less particles. It gets even larger, and it's making our emitter larger and constraining basically the birth rate that we have and the amount of particles being generated based on the size of this emitter. So that's a really cool effect. We'll go back into our object properties, and now we can change this to speed change. And this one's kind of cool. First we'll need to recalculate, and you can already kind of see what's going on just with that quick calculation. But I'm just going to slowly scrub through here, and we can just watch these particles, and as our emitter gets smaller, our particles are really going to start shooting out much faster. And then the larger our emitter gets, the particles will move very slowly and really move a lot less than they would if the emitter was as small as it is at this point, where we can see these particles, the lines are really shooting that out and showing how fast they're moving. And then we can see in the inside just some of those particles kind of coming back in and mixing around because of the size of our emitter. Go back to our object properties, and we can change this to a speed only change. So now this is only going to adjust our speed and not adjust the density. Now for this option, you'll notice that we're not actually able to see visually the size change of this box. But we can still see by looking at the particles that they are in fact moving faster throughout the animation because of those size changes that we have. And if you take a look in the lower left, we can see the numbers are changing through the timeline, and those keys are being taken into account. But of course we don't have that OpenGL visual display of that box. And then we can change this to speed and density fix. And now we have much more particles being generated along with that speed change, giving us a really cool looking effect. I'm going to minimize this panel, and we can just kind of scrub through this. You can see very quickly with our scale set to about 4, once we're reaching that frame, a lot of density and very fast motion. And I would suggest just kind of creating some different effects and lots of different keyframes to play around with these to really figure out which is going to be best for your scene. I'll go ahead and change this to just mass now. And now we can really see there's not too much of a speed increase in just that overall mass and the amount of particles we have being generated caused by that size effect. So that's something really cool that we have available. And then we can change this to mass and density fix. And we'll see the density about the same and extremely fast moving particles for this specific one. We can also see that it's taking a lot longer to calculate this specific effect than it is some of the other ones, and that's more than likely because how drastically we have that speed change, because we're moving the scale very quickly in and out, and for this specific setting it's really shooting these particles outward almost throughout the entire animation. So I can hit Control on the keyboard, and that's just going to cancel our calculation. And you always want to make sure that you're using Control to cancel the calculation. If you do hit the pause button or anything like that, it does have a tendency to crash Lightwave. So that is one thing to keep in mind. Just hit Control if you're canceling your calculation. So we can see all these different changes, and then size no change. If I go ahead and calculate that, we can see a little bit of the overall, not so much the density, but the amount of particles being created based on the size of our emitter. And that's going to be fairly close to the settings that we have for our generator size when this is set to no change. But you still pretty much want to be using that generator size to really start out the initial size of your emitter. 'Cause it'd be a lot easier to work with it that way. And now the next thing we're going to take a look at is our key effect. And currently we have this set to none. But what I want to do is pretty much delete all of these keyframes we have in here at the moment, except the one at frame 0, just because we want to get rid of that scale change. And we're going to create some new keyframes that actually won't be changing anything except letting our dynamics know that there's a key there, and we'll be able to see the reason for that. So we just see our normal emitter right now, and what I'm going to do is just scrub through to frame 60, hit enter, and create a key, and now I've made no change, so it's not going to modify scale or position. I'm just creating some keys. Create another one at 160. We'll do one at 260, and I'm also going to go back and create one around 120. So now we have some keyframes set up. If we go to our key effect and change this to key, and now I'm going to calculate, we can see that when we hit each of our keys, it is generating particles. Now, our generate by is currently set to second, and that means since we only have one frame, it's generating within the birth rate of 100 particles per second. It's only creating a couple particles because it's just one frame. So if we change this from second to frame, now it's going to generate those 100 particles at every frame, or every key. We'll increase our birth rate a little bit higher, bring it up to 500, and now it's going to create 500 particles at each one of our keyframes that we have set up. So before, with the second amount, it's just creating how many it would normally create within a second, but since it's only generating just for one frame, because we have it set to the key effect, then we'll only see a few particles. So it's kind of a neat way to time different bursts. We could have a multiple explosion set up, where we have just a bunch of particles kind of shooting out all within those one frame durations, and give some neat little bursts. We could also set these values to speed. And now right now our emitter is not moving, so none of these are being created just yet. So we're going to come back to that and also take a look at the collision event, wind, and wind speed. I've set this back to frame and go back to our key effect. Now we have a couple of other options too. The key, ENV, basically this is going to give a much smoother effect, and now what we're seeing is a lot more particles being created. I'm going to change that to generate by second, and now we're going to have something a little more gradual, and it does look extremely similar to as if the key effect was off, because our generate by second number is a little high. Change our birth rate down to 50 for the moment. Calculate. And when we scrub through, it's basically transitioning between each of our different frames. Change that back to the frame mode. We see a much more constant animation and birth rate of our particles. So if we time this together with our size effect, we can do some pretty cool looking emitters. What we also have is a parent key, which is basically the same effect. Right now we don't see any particles showing up, so I just want to add an item, and I'm going to go to add object null, and I'm going to create some keyframes for this null. And what I also need to do is set up our motion options for our emitter. So I'll select the emitter, hit M on the keyboard to bring up motion options, and our parent is going to be null. So now, since we already have one frame for our null, which is at frame 0, we can see some particles coming in. But that's the only frame we have set up, so we'll go back to our null. We're going to make some more. Go into frame 75, create a key. Go to frame 140 and create a key. 221, and just kind of randomly creating some keys at the end. And we'll go back, open up our object properties, select our emitter, and click calculate. And now we can see those bursts are controlled by the keyframes of our parent object. Change our birth rate up to 500 so we get some nice little bursts. Calculate. And then we saw those nice little bursts at the end. And then we have the same option as before. And we're seeing more of a just consistent rate. And I'll go ahead and change that back just to our parent key. We're going to go up to the birth rate, and let's just create a quick envelope. And we're just going to tick this little E button, which is going to open up the graph editor on our envelope. And now we can see we have one key set to 500. But what I want to do is towards the end of the animation, or even in the middle, just set a couple of different keys. So if we go down to the lower left, we can see our key. And we could just select that, and now left mouse click onto our timeline to add some different keys. And now we can go up and down with this just to generate some different birth rates. Now keep in mind, what we're seeing right now is just 500.8 to 499. So what we will need to do is click on our magnifying glass, and I'm just clicking and holding down and just moving the mouse vertically, and that'll allow me to shrink this down and see a lot different birth rates. And now if we go back to that first button, which is going to be our move button, you could also hit T on the keyboard to bring that up. We can select our different points and modify this for different birth rates. Go ahead and close that out. And if any time you want to remove that envelope, all you need to do is hold down Shift and click back on that E. But I'm going to go ahead and calculate this first, and we can see our different birth rate changes. So we can see in the beginning about the same rate, where we had around 500. And then we have a bit of a change, a lot less particles, and then even more being created at those different levels. So it's really cool how we can set up these different envelopes to modify our birth rate, and also use that with our textures if we want to do that as well. So now what I want to do is just remove our null from the scene. Select our null, hit the minus key on the keyboard, remove it, and click No for clearing our descendant, because our descendant is the effects emitter. Our key effect I'm going to change to none. Generate by second, just for right now. And I'm going to go through and delete all of our keys that we had set up at all of our different frames. And we're going to be creating some new ones. Making sure I hit delete key and not create key, which it looks like I was doing. You can also hit the delete key on the keyboard to allow you to remove these frames. Okay, so now we are back to that animation we had before, and we're going to create a little bit of motion with our emitter. So making sure our emitter is selected, we're going to either scroll to the move, or we can go to animate and select move. We could also hit T on the keyboard. I'm going to move this emitter back, go all the way to frame 300, and drag our emitter all the way to the end. And then within that area, and let's go to frame 150, I'm going to create a new keyframe, and move our emitter back. And this is going to cause a very slow motion in the beginning, and then it's going to speed up towards the end. And that way we have a nice little speed change. So we can change generate by to speed. Click calculate, and I'm going to hit control and cancel that really quick because our birth rate is set a little too high. Hold down shift and click on that E to get rid of our envelope. And I'm going to bring our birth rate down to 50 for now, because we never know how many particles are going to end up being created. So we'll start with that low number, and we can just take a look. So now we can see the faster we're getting, the more particles we're having being generated, which is a really cool effect. Very small amount of particles at first, and then as it picks up speed, it's going to generate more and more. And we can just see all those coming out, and that's a really neat effect we have. And I'm going to reduce our birth rate a little down to 10 and recalculate, and maybe we can see that a little bit better. So as we're moving slow at first, a very small amount of particles, and then we pick up speed, and our birth rate pretty much doubles, if not triples. And the faster we go, the more particles we're going to have generated by that speed effect. Now there's another option that works with this, and if we go to the Motion tab, and actually I will have to go to ETC tab, and not the Motion tab, we can see a max speed option. And this is really cool. I'm going to set this value to 1 meter and hit calculate. And we're going to see a change now in the way our particles are created. So if we take a look, as we increase that effect, we can see them really trailing behind now instead of spraying out in every direction. And that's just as we pick up our speed. I can increase that amount higher. We'll go ahead and bring it up to 2 meters. Recalculate. And now we see them spraying out a little bit more. Change our max speed down to 0.2 and recalculate. And now instead of them really kind of going out in every direction, which is caused by our explosion, we have them kind of staying behind, and even more so when it's moving faster. So that kind of ties together with our speed effect to give us some more variation throughout our animation. And now I'm going to delete these keyframes, and we're going to stick with this same emitter. And we're going to take a look at another option we have. We're going to go to our Generator tab, and I'm going to change Generate by Collision Event. And now right now we don't see any particles showing up whatsoever, and that's because we don't have a collision added into our scene. We'll go into the Dynamics tab and add in a collision. And I'm going to create a little more of an animation so that we can, of course, collide these together. But if we take a look at the options for our effects collision, we have a mode of bounce, stick, erase, and event, scatter, and attract. So we're going to go to event, and now we have our event set up, which is going to be directly linked to our emitter. So we'll drag this all the way to frame 300, and I'm going to move our emitter through the event and open up our properties for our emitter. Get rid of that max speed effect. And now we can click on calculate, and we can see that with the event collision on, that we are only generating particles in the areas in which we are colliding with our event. We can also see, if we take a look a little bit closer to this, and I'll go ahead and just close out this panel for right now, that only the parts of the emitter that are intersecting are really generating our particles. And that gives us a really neat looking effect. as we pass through this. And we can do this with a lot of different shapes. So I'll go to our last frame, delete the key for right now, go to our event, open the object properties. I'm going to change this to a box, and now increase our radius, and then select our emitter, raise this up outside of our collision, and I'm going to create a quick animation. I'm going to go ahead and change this to a different view, and we're just using the back view, which I have 1 on the number pad. Change to that. You could also switch to the top with number 2. I'm going to hit number 3 to bring us to our right view. And of course, as we keep going, 4 perspective, 5 light view, 6 is the camera view. So if you're not familiar with that, you can use the number pad to switch through your different viewports. You can also hit F4 on the keyboard to cycle through different frames and different setups. But I want to stick with a full view, so we'll go ahead and expand that in the upper right corner. And I'm going to move through 60 frames and just intersect our collision. Bring this up to frame 120 and move it through again. And we'll go up to 180 and bring this kind of through the bottom, and then I'll just go all the way to frame 300 and bring us up through the top. Go to our perspective view and just take a look at that. I also want to create a little bit of motion on our x-axis, so I'm going to go back to our keyframes and just kind of move within the perspective view, just kind of side to side, to create a little more variation. Now if I open up our object properties again, we can hit calculate. We can see we get a really neat looking effect from our emitter, where it's only going to generate in the areas where it's actually within our event. And now with our last area that we have, you can see it's consistently creating our particles, and the other areas are just kind of bursts because it's moving so quickly through our collision. But that gives us a lot of flexibility to create some really interesting looking effects. And of course we can use any of the shapes available as an event collision, and also objects as well. So now I want to reset this once again. We can just delete our keys, and an easier way would be to just save out our scene with those default values. But right now I'm just going to go through and kind of set this up again. Take our event collision and we can remove that from the scene. Minus key on the keyboard and get rid of that. So now we're just back to our emitter, and we're going to open up the object properties panel, select our emitter, and we're going to change this to wind. And now right now we're not really seeing any major changes. We have the explosion effect on, which we're seeing. Change that down to 0 so that we no longer see that affecting our object. And I'm going to add in a wind object. We can just call that wind. Increase our radius to 3 meters. And I'll just position that around our object. And we have a direction mode on right now. And we can see that with our lines. And I'm going to change our power with an envelope. And just add in some keys. And kind of vary that. And we can close that out. And now we have a little bit of variation. And because we don't have an overall force right now, we're not seeing this too much. And technically this should be affecting it directly. So in order to see this effect correctly, we're going to select our emitter. And what we have under the Motion tab is a threshold amount. Now there's threshold 1 and threshold 2. Now for just the wind setting, threshold 2 isn't really going to have an effect on our scene, and it's going to be entirely controlled by threshold 1. And basically our speed going over our overall threshold of threshold 1. So let's go ahead and make some changes to this. We'll set that to 1 meter and calculate. And now we can see some changes showing up. And we can see that once we reach a very low level of wind influence, our particles stop being generated. I'm also going to go back and add a little of explosion so we can see these particles moving a little bit better, and kind of how that breaks up a little bit more. I'll go back to our wind object, and we're going to edit that envelope a little bit more. And I'm going to take our point on the end, the last frame, and really bring that down. And I could also add in some more keyframes and create some different variations very quickly. Let's go back to our emitter and calculate. And now we can see those bursts showing up. And it's all based on that threshold amount that we have under the Motion tab. And let's just go ahead and change this value to 2 meters and calculate. And now we can see that nothing is being generated until we get to that very end point where we have a very high amount of wind. And that's because we need, with that higher value, 2 meters, we need a very strong amount of wind in order to generate those particles. If we can bring it down to 1.5, we're going to get a little more of an in-between value. And now we can see in 2 different areas we have those nice little bursts showing up. Bring that down to 1.2. And now we can see it a little bit more. So that's a really cool way we can control our emission of our particles. And we can also change this now to generate by wind speed. I'm going to go back to our motion, and we can turn off our threshold and calculate. And now we can see the same sort of an effect, but now this is entirely controlled without that threshold setting and our overall wind speed and power. I'll increase our threshold to 1 meter, and we can see that it doesn't really have an overall effect, but it does look like it changed a little, and it has reduced the amount by a little bit. And we also have different values. If we set that up to 2, we're going back to around where we were before. But the major difference, as we can see, is with the speed setting, we really don't need to have a threshold set in order for the effect to work. If it's just set to wind itself, we can see no change throughout the animation. If we change it to wind speed without a threshold amount, then we are going to be able to see the difference. And then of course we can still control that with those threshold values. And when we're not working directly with the wind speed, we have this set to frame or second. With a bit of vibration, we can use these threshold amounts along with that as well to control our bits of vibration. And now I'm going to change this to generate by second. And I'm going to remove our wind from our scene. So we just have this one emitter. I'm going to increase our birth rate up to 50. And we're going to take a look now at the looping option that we have available. And in the menu for the tutorial, there's little GIF animations playing. And most of those were made using this effect. If we go to our ETC tab, etc. tab, we can set up a looping amount and basically a loop frame. So in other words, this is basically the duration of your animation, or how often you want it to be looping. If you're just going to have one motion looping over and over and over again, then that would basically be the length of your animation, and basically to the point where it looks good. I'm going to use frame 60, so we have 60 frames, and after those 60 frames, and basically every 60 frames, it's going to play out the exact same motion on our particles. Now, one problem we can see is that we need those first couple of frames to really generate our motion before we can see the looping amount. So what we can do is set this to a fixed amount, and now set our start frame to -60. And now we can already see our particles showing up. The only problem is that's still not far enough. But we do want to make sure that we are going to be doubling the number of our length. So right now it's 60. And that's not enough, so we need to go to -120. And since that is still not enough, I'm going to go way beyond that and double that amount and bring us up to 240. And as long as all of our particles are within view, we'll be able to see this looping and playing over and over again with the same motion. So go ahead and zoom in a little bit here. And basically what we want to look for is I'm going to set this to frame 280 and click play. And if you take a look, when it rolls over to the beginning of the animation, the particles are in the same place and we don't have any glitches. So that's a really cool way we can set up looping animation for our particles. Just set that amount, and always just make sure your start frame will have that set early enough in order to see all of your particles continuously moving. Now, one thing to keep in mind is this does not always work with collisions. You will sometimes run into problems with certain collision effects because of the way they are calculated and change over time. It may not always loop correctly, and that's one thing to just kind of keep in mind when you're trying to loop a collision effect. And that's more so something with objects rather than some of the just default collisions. And now we're just going to take a look at one last thing. I'm going to turn off our fixed value, and it's going to start from the beginning once again. Go back and turn off that loop frame. And we're going to take a look at the Edit Effects tab. We have some very powerful tools in here for editing our particles, and sometimes you can run into instances where you're calculating a group of particles and everything looks great, but you just have maybe one stray particle that's just kind of shooting off of the scene. Well, this is a way for us to modify individual particles. And first what I want to do is change the way we are displaying our particles. So if we go to our particle tab, what I can do is turn on show ID. Now this is going to set a number to every single particle that we have and show us basically the order in which they are created. And this will be a lot easier to identify some of these different particles when we have numbers on them. What we can also do is set up a show size. Now right now our size is set to a default value of 0, and all of our particles are really quite large. So what we would need to do is change this size value and also set our output size. If I turn on output size, that's going to be our absolute value that we have set, and since it is set to 0, we are not seeing the size of our particles. Let's go ahead and change that up to 1, and now that's basically that default we were at before. Bring that down to 0.2, and we have much smaller particles. So I'll just bring that down to 0.1, and we could also set a variable if I wanted to. I could set that to 0.2, and now we can see all different sized particles. And this is really helpful for a lot of different things where we can directly link hypervoxels to these sizes, and also with our interaction, these different sizes will play a huge role in that, and also with the effects linker where size becomes an option. So go back, and I'm going to get rid of our variable, and we're just going to take a look at them at this size. Go back to our Edit Effects tab, and now throughout the animation I'm just going to move to frame 300. And now if I just click directly in the scene, we're not really able to directly modify our particles just yet. So what we need to do is click on Edit Tool. Now that did kind of move around the position of our particles, and it might have calculated them a little bit differently. But now with the Edit Tool selected, I can grab one of our particles and move it off to the side. Just drag the timeline to refresh, and now we can see that particle is starting out off on the right of the screen. And now we also see that it's a very straight line that we have, but we can also modify that. And there's a couple of different modes for this. If we select our fall off over on the left, we have linear, soft, and hard. And this will allow us to control the curvature of our animation when we create keyframes. Let's start out by selecting linear and move that off to the side. And now we see a very rigid edge where our particle is going to move on very straight lines to bounce back and forth. We can hit undo, and now that keyframe has been removed. So we want to use the undo within our panel and not the undo that we would normally have within layout. If we change this to soft and now move our particle, we can see a very nice curve that will be able to move our particle along. I'm going to go ahead and undo that, and we could switch this to hard. And when we move that off, we see an entirely different effect. Very similar to the linear, except that we're pulling out a very large section, and it's sort of creating a very symmetrical shape in our curve. I'm going to undo that as well, but we can set up different keyframes, and I'm going to use the soft option and just kind of move our particle off to the side and create a couple of different keyframes. And these keyframes are directly on the particle itself, and we're not going to see them within our timeline. But we do have some other options as well. We can constrain how we'd like to move these particles. We can also change rotation as well. And if we set up rotation options, which we can take a look at in a minute, you'll see how we can constrain those different options. And now we also have some different editing settings, and these are going to be directly related to our fix. I'm going to set this to all right now, but we have these fix settings, and basically this is a way to make sure that you don't edit particles within a certain time frame. So let's say between frame, let's turn on both of our fix, between frame 60 and 90, I don't want to be able to, or I want to be able to modify our particles only within those frames. So let's go before frame 60 to frame 50, select our particle and try to move it, and we can see that we can't. Once we move into frame 60, between 60 and 90, and now I can click, and now I have the ability to move and create our new keyframes and our additional motion for our particle. And once we move past frame 90 now, if I try to move this, we can see that I can't. So those fix options are really helpful. We can edit frames, we can do after. And right now it is currently not moving, so here we go. Turn off our fix amount because we are outside of our value. And now we have this set to after. And what's happening is this creating a very quick motion where it's just going to basically jump from one side of the screen to the other. Go ahead and undo that. If we set before, now we're creating a keyframe before at this exact amount, and it's going to jump from that other area. Undo that. We can go to current, and this is going to be our current frame where we're going to see it just for one frame move to that outer position, and there's going to be no blend. And we can see it's very quick. So once we're at frame 146, we can see it moved out. If we go to frame 145, it's back along that curve. 147, it's back on the other side. Go ahead and undo that. Set this to all, so we no longer have that edit frame turned on. And let's take a look at some of our other commands. If we take a look down here, we can see command. Now what I can do is clone our particles so we can create different additions. We can apply these different changes to other particles, but one of the really cool functions we have is the make path option. If I select make path right now, what it's done is taken all of these keyframes from that particle and converted it to a null object. So now we can use these particles to generate null objects that we might be able to link to other objects, and now it's something that's active within the scene. So that's really cool that we have the ability to do that. And that particle is still within our null, and we can see it, but now we also have a null object following along that path. So that's a really cool thing we can do. I'm going to go back to our emitter, and we're going to take a look just really quickly at a couple other settings. And with our size on now, and then we can actually see our particles, if we go to rotation, I'm going to turn on align to path. And now we can see our rotation has changed, and each one of our spheres is following along its own path. We can also see that with that null object, that although it was showing up in our display before as a small particle, we can no longer see it or edit it with our other particles. So it has completely changed that. But the rotation, we can see it's following along their paths. We could also set this to the random rotate and scale, which is the same as our effects linker. So we could set up some random options here. I'm just going to type in 300 for our minimums, and our maximums I'm going to set to 900. And this is just the initial orientation. If I click OK, now we can see that these are positioned in different ways, but still staying in their same rotation. So if we want, we could add a little bit of spin. And we'll go ahead and set these values for 50 to the minimum and 300 for our maximum. We could also have random scales, min and max, if we don't want to use the size function. But now we can see all of those particles spinning around. And that way we can set up a lot of this stuff before we use the effects linker to give us a lot more control within our scene if we're going to be linking these two objects, because then we can just carry this rotation over from the particle amount to the effects linked object. So that's a really cool thing that we have available. And what we could also do, if I go to our edit tool, I'm going to select one of these particles and I can hit delete. And that will just remove a particle from that emitter completely. So if you do have a stray particle kind of shooting off in your scene, all you need to do, select your particle, hit delete, and then you can remove it entirely from your object and just kind of get rid of those different ones that will show up.